Chapter 3 looks at these historical perspectives. In Chapter 2, we took a longitudinal look at history, and we met a lot of people that were involved in a lot of the scenarios. But this takes at just how the school process got to where it is. And let me just take you back where this is now. Here's the topical outline. First of all, more students in bigger schools and things like that, the enrollment growth, busing, those types of things we'll go through. And then more changes, challenge perspectives like the involvement of the federal government. And you'll hear me whine about that. Even constitutionally, they have no business in education. You'll see that they've got a big thing. And then the changing aims. And these will all be different steps that different generations, different times have taken to try and make a solid school experience. And then this is you. Lots of hubbub about preparing teachers in the different stages. And I've told you before, I've been around long enough now that I've seen changes also in how we prepare the teachers. And then these recent trends in education. So let's take a look here. Here is the objectives. List and details several of the most important changes that have been made in the U.S. education system during the past half century. I've explained the major changes in the evolution of teaching profession. Discuss development of major aims of education. Explain the evolution of teacher training in the United States. That's you. Name something important in major historical trends. And decide, explain, and defend the degree to which you believe it's possible now, possible to know, understand, and profit from the history of education. So, why we should study it. This is about the history of the federal role in education, and things like the Morrill Act of 1890 was the Fed's early involvement in this. Biggest pieces maybe were the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, 72, 504 probably rehabilitation, maybe none bigger than 94-142 for special ed, but nonetheless it was the federal government taking control of what was supposed to be left entirely to the states and telling you what to do, and you'll do it because you want the money. So more schools and bigger schools have occurred. The phenomenal change of growth in both the size and complexity of educational establishments, tremendous new demands and expectations. Let me see if I have those in the notes. Yes. Equal educational opportunities for all students, some of the things I just mentioned, and this practical value of history in education. So let's look at these things. Enrollment growth, and this is going to be your number one, is you're going to make a statement about each of these 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things here. That's all under number one. And let me give you a quick what some of these should be. Size of educational enterprise, the total number of public school students in the United States has about doubled. And I think there's a question on the test where you have to say that how much bigger it is in the last half century. Part of this rapid growth in school enrollment was attributed to the overall population growth. A good part is due to the greater percentage of people who are attending school. Future people are staying in school much longer, shown by most. And again, there's questions on the test about that. And then one thing you're not allowed to say, it also has to do with immigration, both legal and illegal. Regularly has really bloomed our schools. And if you see down south in Texas, Arizona, they're overwhelmed by the number of people coming that are first-time students, first time to this country, whatever means. And that's a big portion of this also that we're not allowed to talk about. What about the need for more schools? School will dramatically increase. The need of classrooms or buildings also increase. The need of new schools was generally concentrated in the suburbs. In fact, because of increased busing, and there's a question on the test about that one of the things that increased because of the schools is busing. I'm going to get this to the yellow. Okay, because of school consolidation and shifting population, smaller rural schools were no longer needed, whereas more intensely populated areas saw dramatic changes. Sort of temporary mobile classrooms. So I'm going to put that on here, question number 1. For you to respond to. Ever taught in a temporary or mobile classroom? Some of you have, and some of you haven't, but it got to be a trend, especially in some of our smaller schools. And I got to say to you, I've observed more than once, more than twice, in mobile classrooms. And probably the strangest thing I ever had, there was one school that was so overcrowded that the classroom that my student teacher was assigned to met in the library. That was their classroom, in the library. And kids came and went and used it as a normal library while they were teaching in there. And I'd never seen like it, but that's what they did. Okay. So all kinds of ways to maximize schools. Obviously larger classes, split scheduling. Back in the 60s and 70s, my wife's cousins went to school in a suburb in Chicago, and they grew so fast. That's what they did, is you either went to school from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. or from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. And so it was how they got by, and they built a bunch of schools. But like any suburb that explodes like that, the growth stopped just as suddenly when all of a sudden the suburb was maximized out size-wise. The kids all went through the school system and suddenly had way too many buildings and buildings and stuff, so they sold a couple elementaries, closed one middle school, and only used half the high school building in the years to come. But initially they were kind of blown out. But sometimes you need that. More teachers, as you expect, more kids, more teachers. School district consolidation. The number of separate school districts has reduced from 117 in 1940 to 14, even though we have twice as many kids, way less districts. And that goes back to 1940, is we still had so many one-room schoolhouses. We still had so many rural schools. And those were all considered districts. And they were closed and consolidated with the communities. And now think of how many of our communities in South Dakota, our smaller communities, have consolidated again to shrink that number even more. And then the growth of busing. With that, percentage of students who are bused to school have increased considerably during this past 75 years, as the total cost per pupil cost of bus. In addition, general busing students have studied a school consolidation, integration stuff. We used to haul. You don't hear much about it anymore, but there was a time in the 70s where they said we can't have schools that are all black or all white, so they'd put some of the black kids on a bus, haul them an hour or two across town in our bigger cities to go to the white school, grab some of the white kids and haul them across town. And as you can imagine, it had horrible consequences, but that's what they did. It was called busing, and you don't hear that term anymore refer to that. Busing students to school is a big operation. U.S. Educational is estimated 60% of students use the bus, about 450,000 school buses. So here's what we're going to do for busing now to see if you bust, is come back to this chapter page. I linked 2 links here. One is riding the bus, and it's just a form where you say whether you rode the bus or not. And you say, yes, I rode the bus, and I'm from the campus section. And then you submit, because I think that would be interesting. And then it should go away like this. And then you can come back here and say responses. And it may not be instantaneously, but it should be pretty quick, where you can kind of see the results of what other people do. And then go ahead and click out of these. You won't need those anymore. But that will be part of the lecture. Okay. So bigger school and bigger budgets. Again, 3.5 and 1940. It kind of takes you through what it costs here. And again, you want to have some knowledge of that. Don't give me all this. You read each of these and bring something out of it. Same with rapid curricular growth and changes. Constant changes and growth that way. Growth of special ed programs, as I told you, the most important, make sure you mention this, Public Law 94-142 was probably the biggest significant thing in that, changes and growth of special ed. Okay, so that's that one. So here's the federal government, and let's take a look at that. And the authors obviously are not opposed to this. Like I said, for the most part, schools seem to want the money, and so we'll do whatever. We tell ourselves we're so starved, so we'll take all kinds of involvement as long as they give us money. And what they do, in my experience, is they underfund whatever they're going to do, and that's where you end up doing things. For example, the last administration put out a bunch of money called Race to the Top, and if you would come up plans that would supersede the current federal law, No Child Left Behind, you would get money. And of course what happened is the states that got it for their schools were certain color states and the other ones weren't. And so we saw a lot of them do things like that, and then what the feds end up doing is not fully funding it, and then after 3 years or 5 years it quits, and then we have programs started that we can't fund anymore. So feature beginning of the chapter, federal government has played an increasing role. Policymakers in the federal have provided funds for specific education programs that have passed many laws, regulations. Presidents have created programs and regulations affecting schools and federal courts, handed down decisions. Various federal agencies have created programs and regulations for our schools, and that's the other thing is not only they want to regulate or control that way, but they want to regulate them. You can find much more contemporary information on federal of education, school law, policies, finance in the book. And 40s saw the nation at war, which provided impetus to the federal governments to pass a number of laws, and that's what they're talking about here was Sputnik. The Russians were getting into space before us, and of course the assumption is our schools are bad, our schools are bad, our schools are bad, and so they rushed out there and tried to pour a bunch of money into schools to try and make them better. The industry produced goods in national defense. The program operated through state educational agencies, trained more than 7 million workers. In 41, the Lamb Act provided funds for building, maintaining, and operating community facilities where the local communities had unusual burdens because of defense and war initiatives. So then there's the GI Bill. You'll figure out what that is. Natural science, categorical aid, just a history of things here. There's a question on the test about this educational opportunity thing. And so we're coming back here, and this will be your number 2. You'll put something about each of these specific steps in there. This one here I just hit for you, and then these two, this will be your number 2, educational opportunity right here, and then gives you a little more about it. And then here's the last 2 pieces of federal law that were passed by the immediate past 2 administrations in the White House. So 2 of the federal government's more recent major efforts, education for children, are sweeping laws commonly referred to as No Child Left Behind, so you know that. More recent, Every Child Succeeds, and that was to make separation. While the goals of these laws are admirable, they have been widely criticized. Make sure you put this in there, especially by the education profession. Examples of the criticism are sufficient funds have not been made available, the mandated testing required by the laws is not sufficiently valid or reliable. These laws and requiring testing do not take into account extremely varied abilities in students. And what it really didn't take into consideration is the kids that come from our generational poverty communities. So this one here, the more recent, currently effective ESA, will be discussed more elsewhere in this book. Okay. And so you address each of those. So what does professionalization of teaching mean? Well, think back with me. Where was this? Where did this begin? Some of you have seen the show Little House on the Prairie, shown in syndication, something from the 70s. You'll see in there the one-room schoolhouses, and the teacher, as part of the main characters, had virtually no training at all. A lot of times 16, 17 years old could become teachers with a high interest in to demonstrate some competency in it, but certainly nothing beyond that. And then slowly over the year history, there was training programs and certifications and things like that got involved, that we call that the professionalization, where they had to have training and be certified. And in addition to that, teacher ed had many facets like curriculum, teaching methodologies, training of school service personnel like administrators, counselors, librarians. All those needed training then. So that's what the professionalization of that is. And again, I'm going to give you these, where you're going to make a statement about each of these. And again, I don't understand the little bitty, just a small amount, still probably 25% of our students are educated in private schools or home schools away from public schools, and this is about all that's covered in it. I don't quite understand that, but nearly all schools in colonial America were private. And that's part of the history we don't teach you, but that was the origin of schools, is the churches ran it. And religion was the main purpose of education at the time. Children were taught to read primarily so they could study the Bible. And we've had that before. And now, of course, Jesus is not welcome in our schools at all. And it's so interesting from where we came to where we're at. Most early colleges were private, existing primarily to train ministers. And again, even in our colleges, that the origin was Christian. And now Jesus isn't welcome. In fact, he is very unwelcome. As the public school system developed, however, the religious nature and education gradually diminished to the point relatively few children attend religious schools. And there have always been certain religious groups, however, that labor to maintain their own private schools and instruction to permeate the areas of curriculum. The most notable of these religions have been the Roman Catholic Church, and you know that most of the private schools are still Catholic. During the past 25 years, the enrollment in non-Catholic religious schools has grown dramatically. And we have the one here in Sioux Falls Christian, who is non-Catholic. And you seem to see more and more of that. My kids went to a Christian elementary school that was non-Catholic. Dramatically, whereas Catholic school enrollments has declined somewhat. And let me tell you what that looks like. My dad graduated from high school in '54, so he went to the schools in the 40s and the early 50s. In his time in school, the Catholic schools, he went to a Catholic school, and they weren't allowed to play in tournaments and stuff with the public schools, so they had their own Catholic high school tournament, basketball tournament. And at the time, you cannot imagine how many Catholic schools there were in South Dakota in our small communities, which have all but dried up. Now you could probably name the 4 or 5 Catholic high schools that are left in the state. And so that'll give you some idea. So, despite the trend, some Catholic dioceses operate extremely large school systems, sometimes larger than the public school. One example, Chicago Archdiocese, which operates one of the largest Catholic school systems in the United States. With rare exception, private and parochial schools struggle to raise funds they need to exist. They typically must charge a tuition and fee, and that's quite obvious that it costs money. And I paid $3,000 a year so my kids could go to a small Christian school, and of course that was quite some time ago. Relying on private contributions, conduct various fundraising activities to do so. In recent years, districts have made tuition vouchers available. Okay, and there's lots of hubbub. We'll talk about that later. But one of the things, as you see here, this fee is why a lot of times our poor kids, our generational poverty kids, can't possibly attend the private schools, which notoriously have been rated as better than our public schools. Now, homeschooling, nothing new here. You're familiar with it. I mean, do you know somebody that's homeschooled? Do you have anybody in your life that homeschooled their kids, or friends that were homeschooled? I could go on and on about this, about homeschooling, and the people that we know had several reasons. One, obviously, is religious things, but more so, a couple we know, a next door neighbor took their kid out of school, and their boy went to a private school, but they felt the family felt that they weren't meeting his child's need. He was dyslexic and wasn't getting the attention, and so the mom quit her job and homeschooled him for about 4 years. And now he's studying to be an engineer, and life is dramatically different. Some have religious motives, want their children to do a particular religious thing. And for the most part, assumption still is private school is associated with affluence. I'm telling you, I went to a Catholic school. My dad, it really was a burden for them to pay, but they felt it was important. Recently developed from a majority of those who homeschool is a philosophy sometimes as unschooling or non-schooling. And I don't know if you've ever heard of those terms, which parents provide no formal instruction. So think of this, no formal instruction, but allow their children to learn through whatever naturally they do, as one expect many different perspectives in the value of homeschooling in our society. And we could have a big debate about that, and there's often are, the value of homeschooling, but the ones that do it are very convinced, and often their biggest foes are public schools. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was teaching in middle school, one day when the basketball season was going to start, there was a kid showed up for basketball tryouts that we'd never seen. And so the other coach and I wandered over there and asked kind of what was going on. And he informed us he was a homeschool kid. And we said, gee, in South Dakota, I don't think we can have homeschool kids in our program. But I tell you what, you stay today, and we'll find out. We'll let you know tomorrow. Okay? Well, in one practice, we saw that he could play, and we said, oh, guess what? You can stay. And so he played every game with us, and I don't know what happened to him or where it was, but he was a homeschool kid that wanted to play basketball. Then his continuing adult education came from the '64 Economic Act. You can write about that. Evolution of educational testing. Look at whatever criticisms. Read this carefully and make some statements about that. Okay, the changing aims, and again, there's a ton, and you're going to get this the same way. Let me talk about the changing aims before I take you through these. The aims of the system over the years during colonial times, the overriding aim of education at all levels was to enable students to just be able to read so they could understand the Bible. So that was the minimum. Learned people could read. And if you see any of the shows from the old days in syndication, the people that were educated could read and read fluently. And that was why, so they could read the Bible, gain their salvation, spread the gospel of Jesus. Well, after the colonies won independence in England, those objectives changed. The common language, attempted intense patriotism, develop a national feeling of unity. And just like today, that was the beginning of putting that all in schools. You take care of these cultural things. So then over the time, and follow along, make sure you mention these. Here is the Committee of 10. established by the NEA, studying the function of the high school committee known as Committee of 10. Made an effort to do these things, and would you please bring these in? 1, 2, 3, 4 things in to the Committee of 10, and also this description. Okay. Also recommended trying to graduate high school students earlier to permit them to attend college. At the time, accreditation implied that high schools had a college preparatory function. So you think of this. In 1892, get the kids ready for college. So it was already a real narrow group that went to high school and became learned. Then the 7 cardinal principles. And here, this is here. It brought all these in for you. Okay, so you don't have to do those. And then here, these cardinal principles right here for 1900. And again, look what we moved here from 1892 right away. Later, not too much later, we had these cardinal principles to try and give a framework or a form of what should be taught. Problem was partly overcome in 1918. So within 20 years, we had another step here. Cardinal principles of secondary, usually referred to as the 7 cardinal principles. Only one section of the basic principles discussed in the original text, but part of that became famous. These principles stated that the student should receive their education in these things. So what I'm going to ask you is, what are each of these things? And this will be number 4 here. And you may have to Google these. And if you Google 7 cardinal principles, it'll give you more about each of these. And so make one line on each of these of what they meant or why they were there. Okay. Then here's the 8-year study that came from here. And look where this was a little bit later yet. So look at us jump through here of people suggesting here's what you should be teaching in high school. Here's one 1892. Now this one 1918. And by the 30s to 40s, we said, hey, we've got this study now, this 8-year study from Progressive Education Association in 38, and grew an 8-year study. And again, it's somebody setting aside saying, I know what should be taught, and there it is. Okay, you don't have to do anything with that, but know about this, the 8-year study, and then the purpose of education and democracy. And I think we have that too. And it gives you those there, what those purposes are. See, let's see when that was. And make sure you put these dates in each one. That came with this in 38. And then education of all youth in 44. That looks right there. And maybe if that's what you have to do here, you have to put the date in here. 1944. And again, there's questions on the test about this, the education of all youth. And imperative needs of youth in 52. So you can see regularly these are being spit out. Okay. And this is 1952. And again, it's a time of Sputnik where, hey, we're getting behind. Let's go. We'll tell you what should be taught. And that's what that comes. So here's our official question. Should we teach manners in the classroom? So that also is going to come up here for you to respond to. Because lots and lots of debate about that should be. And please read this first so you can react according to this. Okay. All right. Again, like I say, these topics are on the test, so please know them. Then the preparation of teachers. So this will be our number 5. 5 looks like this, where you talk very briefly about each of these from the textbook. And there's quite a bit here about the lack of training in Europe as the teachers came to this country, and then here about there was very little training, and then as indentured servants, and there's a piece about that. What does that mean? And then teaching apprenticeships, and what did that mean? And teacher training in academies, what did that mean? Let me take you here. These will be number 6. Right here, academies, normal schools, state colleges. Here, in normal schools, first type of American institution devoted exclusively to teacher training. Every school had one. Our state, many early educators recognized the country's need for better qualified teachers. It wasn't until 1820 the first teacher training in the United States. Private school named normal school after European, which had existed since the late 17th century, was established by this people here. The first state normal school was adopted to Europe teacher training in Lexington, Massachusetts. So put that in your mind. That's the first state normal school. A normal school usually consists of a 2-year course. I'll tell you how that went. My mother-in-law, who was deceased, had a 2-year degree, and in the time she was teaching, and this is how it changes, it was deemed that to a certain point, your school, your contract, your credential, your certificate, your licensure to teach was no good anymore if you only had a 2-year, unless you got your 4-year. So she went summers and nights and really kind of drove herself to finish this degree in the middle of her life when she was raising families, because she didn't want to lose her job teaching. Okay, students typically entered the normal school after finishing elementary school. Most normal schools did not require high school graduation. Think of that, put that in there. Till about 1900. Show you normal school curriculum was the high schools in this. Horace Mann put his name in there, was very influential in the normal schools. And the first state supported, this is finally the state who was responsible for teaching, which opened in 39. Other public normal schools established shortly afterwards were typically offered 2-year teacher training. Some of the students came directly from elementary and then state teacher colleges followed that, and I'm going to let you do that. Every state had to have a normal school, and this will be here, goes on here. So in South Dakota, it's not referred to this anymore, but there is one of the universities is a normal school, and was created with the sole intent to be a normal school. And you will do a little Googling and figure that out, and I'm going to make that number 7. Okay, and as you know, now they are most of our private universities in South Dakota have teacher ed programs, but most of our private ones do also. And so you will get that, and then changes to this time kind of takes you through here, that medieval and then apprenticeship and teacher training, and then to a normal school, and then private state teacher colleges, then state colleges to universities, and teacher education today. And so you'll see that and that trend there. Recent trends. Here's what that looks like. Let me have you look at these. Analysis of teaching. And I want you to bring these in for each one and know what they are, because there's questions on the test about this. The evolution of educational technology. Lots written about that. And the study of the learning process is new. Do I have those all in here? Each of these. So will be our number 8. When you talk about what each of these things are and what contribution each of those made. And then these critics here. First of all, I want to just look at what this learning process, all these investigators have stressed the importance of successful early learning patterns with learning deficits. And it's still, we know a lot, we studied a lot about learning problems, but much to know. Nobody seems to be able to find it. I don't think we're any farther along than we were when I studied special ed in the 90s. And so I don't know what's newly developed, but kids are still falling through the cracks, especially our kids that come from these generational poverty homes. They also believe the important elements with the environment may be changed to modify and promote learning. Social development theory in the 1800s suggested social interaction among children plays a major role in this cognitive development. And so what are we going to do with that? Gee, you don't have enough interaction. We created daycares and Head Start programs that identify specific developmental tasks they believe children must be able to master. He even suggested periods during which certain tasks must be mastered an equal part of the children's repertoire. So here's Piaget. Piaget had this cognitive development thing. Okay, and then Skinner had the behavioral theory, and there's questions on the test that you have to know what those are. And then educational critics, another change in education was pointed out by the critics, differences, perspectives on educational standards, including Friedenberg, all these people that had to take their shot at it. Some critics, such as Siebelman, urged schools to refurbish what they had already have. Others, including Lidge, wanted to abandon schools altogether. The critics have not gone unnoticed, and that goes on today. And I'm one of them. Now, because I have DR in front of my name, I'm a critic. One of the things I've learned the hard way that there is no such thing as free speech, so I try to be careful, and that's why recording these lectures I've gotten myself in trouble, because now it's documented and been called on the carpet a couple times about opinions that I've had, and you can't have them and be in my position. So here's some major educational events of the past century. I'm going to let you look at this. I want to point out a couple things. And I think I'm going to give you this one for you to import. This will be a clip. And I will say this is number 9. That is, you're going to put this in your notes. And it takes you through all the eras in recent history and what those contributions were. And see if you can see any patterns here. And this is a more developed one. It's too big, so I'm going to clip this one and put it in there for you to okay. This is chapter 3, so I'm going to say it's 3.1. So this is where you'll find it right here. Now I have it linked. You click on it, it's like this. It should show up like this. You download it like this one, and then you should have it. Right, and it goes right here, right below here. So let's go back to this, and very interesting piece here. Look, especially here, public posting of test scores for all schools, standards, data-driven things, accountability, and it just made people mad. Nobody wants to be accountable for learning, and so that's what that came out to be. Yeah, difficult to draw meaningful inference from these events not yet stood the test of time, and that's what's interesting is we can criticize, and I'm really good at that, but you don't know till a time. Results of recent educational events will actually be found in the answer to questions such as these. What should the role of federal government be in education? And I predict in your time, in the very near future, that they will take complete control of curriculum, standards, stuff like that. But they don't want to eat the whole hog at one time, so they eat smaller pieces till they've eaten the whole hog, and we will allow them to do that because they will give us money to allow them to do that. How can the equal opportunity achievement be in the United States? How much autonomy and freedom should teachers have and school systems have? And that's inconsistent with the federal government taking over as teachers, having a say. To what degree should educational policy and practice influence litigation? How will school reform movements change in practice and education? What will be expanding and evolving future role of technology in our schools? I'd love to know what that will look like. Also, is what will we be doing with technology in the future that we're not doing now? And I'm going to ask you to speak to that right now. I'm going to put this in the discussion for you to say what you think that would be. So I come back up here and I say here, future role of technology in our schools. And what I want you to do in here, name one specific thing. Say name something that we will do with technology in the future that we don't do now. And I'm going to put this in here as part of you. That will be your number 10. Tech. Okay. Go back to our textbook and flip the page. Looking back, it helps us look ahead. A little thing like this, and I'm going to show you what that is. You don't have to do anything with this, just know changes are happening more rapidly now in education than ever before. And here, that's me. I can't get my arms around it. I can't believe how quick it's changing. My kids are going through high school, and I cannot believe how it changes. Expect experience changes, challenges, and diverse perspectives on education during the career as an educator. Nice thing, you grew up, you came through school in a time with rapid changes. I did not, and so that's why. And I'm old and cranky now, and that makes it harder too. Knowing and understanding the history of education will help an educator to adapt, and that's why we do this. And I would agree. You walk back through the history we've done here in 2 chapters. It helps you understand a little bit of where some of the things come from. What I propose to you also is that we'll make mistakes. We'll continue to make mistakes because we don't look back at history. We jump quickly, and in big things. I follow a couple blogs that are supposedly educational purists, and the changes they're proposing are just crazy. But they got a big following, and you'll see some things coming down the road. But I say I'm also old enough and cynical enough to know that everything goes around comes around in here. So, okay, that's chapter 3. Best to you with this.